Dan sudah tentu kalau kita nak bercakap pula untuk blog ini, kita nak memberi fokus berkenaan dengan syarikat ataupun startup unicorn. Sejauh mana, di mana kita berada kalau kita nak bandingkan kedudukan kita di peringkat Asia Tenggara sebagai contoh. Jadi saya ada beberapa angka dan juga mengambil contoh beberapa syarikat-syarikat pesaing-pesaing ataupun bagaimana negara-negara jiran kita menyokong startup ataupun syarikat-syarikat unicorn ini. Pertamanya, antaranya ataupun dalam senarai yang dikongsikan oleh CB Insights di mana saya ambil di sini, banyak sebenarnya syarikat-syarikat. Tetapi kalau nak diperincikan di dalam ini, Kasem di Malaysia hanyalah satu-satunya syarikat yang tersenarai di dalam CB Insights ini, iaitu dengan valuation sekitar 1.7, focusing on e-commerce and direct to consumers. Okey, next kita ada daripada Singapura. Singapura antara yang negara yang mempunyai paling banyak startup di dalam Asia Tenggara ini, seperti Hellroot, Moglix dan juga Koda Payments. Banyak sebenarnya. Ini antaranya yang saya senaraikan dengan valuation kalau kita lihat sekitar dengan angka yang begitu tinggi, 3.5 billion dollar, 2.6 billion dollar dan juga 2.5 billion dollar. Antara sektor yang mereka terlibat seperti e-commerce dan juga fintech, termasuk mobile and telecommunications. Ini yang utama. Dan kemudian kita nak lihat juga di Vietnam. Sebagai contoh, Vietnam juga mempunyai fintech yang boleh dikatakan ataupun syarikat unicorn yang boleh dikatakan dengan angka valuationnya sekitar 3 billion dollar. Sky Mavis, dan kemudian di Vietnam juga ada 2.27 billion dollar melibatkan Momo Mobile Money, dan kita ada Flash Express di Thailand, dan rakan kita jiran Filipina juga mempunyai seperti Mint dan juga Revolution Precrafted. Antara bidang-bidang ataupun industri yang terlibat seperti di fintech, bidang fintech, supply chain, logistik, delivery, terutamanya kalau kita nak nampaklah dalam bidang unicorn ini, Najib dan juga Dina, lebih kepada syarikat-syarikat unicorn ini banyak memfokuskan kepada fintech. Rakan jiran kita yang paling dekat, Indonesia, JNT Express, ramai menggunakan perkhidmatan JNT Express, nilainya adalah 20 bilion dolar. Dan ini merupakan satu angka yang cukup besar melibatkan syarikat unicorn, cukup kukuh, boleh dikatakan satu angka yang cukup kukuh melambangkan kekuatan syarikat JNT Express ini. Traveloka 3 bilion, Aku Laku dan juga Kopi Kenangan. Ini antara unicorn, syarikat-syarikat unicorn yang mengukuhkan syarikat-syarikat ataupun kedudukan keuangan mereka, menunjukkan mereka cukup sebuah syarikat yang cukup kukuh. Najib dan juga Nina, mungkin ada cerita yang lebih lanjut berkenaan dengan bagaimana cerita kita di Malaysia ini.
Okey, kita perlu jelaskan juga unicorn ini adalah syarikat startup yang mencapai penilaian di atas 1 bilion dolar. Itu yang kita ingin capai di Malaysia ini. With us this morning to comment on this is Aaron Sarma, General Partner of ScaleUp Malaysia. Good morning, Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Aaron, looking at the numbers of unicorns around the region, and also if we do comparison, it's obvious that we are lagging behind. And also we started many initiatives before. Aaron, what went wrong?
Oh, that's a very loaded question, Najib, but I'll try my best to get through it, right? Actually, Malaysia is one of those countries that really started early. We started in 1997 with all our digital initiatives with MDC, which became MDEC, and we tried to build a whole industry around technology and the emerging economy around that. But yes, we've had challenges, right? I just want to address one thing before we go on, right? I think a lot of people will ask, what's the big deal about unicorns and why is it something that people want, right? And I think one thing that people need to realize is that unicorns are important because of its economic impact, job creation, and also its ability to attract FDI, right? But I think one of the challenges we have, and I really enjoyed Harik's presentation just now, looking at the unicorns in the region. And what you will notice is that there are basically two kinds of unicorn companies in the region. There are nations that have built unicorns that are very local. So you look at Indonesia, all the unicorns basically mostly operate within Indonesia. The same goes for Vietnam, similar story in Thailand, similar story in the Philippines. And there are actually only two markets that require a unicorn to build a regional story, and that is Singapore and that is Malaysia. So, and part of the reason for that is quite normal. The reason for that is because the ecosystem in Malaysia, or the size of the market in Malaysia, and Singapore is not large enough to sustain its own unicorn. If you just look at the math, like, let's just assume a unicorn is a company that does $100 million of revenue a year. And of course, every industry is different, and the multiples of valuation are different per industry. But let's, for math's sake, let's just have that argument. That means you need 100 customers who will pay you $1 million, or 10 million customers who can pay you $10, right? And in Malaysia, we certainly don't have that marketplace, which is why it's easier to build a unicorn just in Indonesia and be happy there. If a Malaysian entrepreneur wants to build a unicorn business, they need to think regional from day one. They cannot say, I'm going to become a juara kampung and I'll build Malaysia first and then go regional. That's not the way they can do it, because no single Singaporean startup thinks this way, because they have no choice. In Singapore, they say, I have to build an ASEAN story, and they build it. And if you look at the stories that are like Parson, the reason it's successful is because they built a regional story. I would always argue Grab was born in Malaysia, and Grab is successful because it built a regional story. So I think if Malaysia wants to build unicorns, the trick is we need to get our entrepreneurs to think regional, not local, building a story that goes to multiple markets. And what I hear from a lot of VCs around the region is that when a Malaysian founder has opened the second market or the second nation, they are very, very attractive to VCs, because they know Malaysian entrepreneurs are very, very versatile, very resourceful, and very diligent in how they build a business.
So Aaron, certainly there's a lot of best practices we can learn from our regional peers, countries like Vietnam or even Indonesia. So what can we learn and emulate or follow in our strategies?
I think that's an interesting question, and as I was mentioning just now, that sometimes it's a bit different to apply a strategy from Vietnam or Indonesia, because I guess an Indonesian startup will look at it very differently, right? But I will say there's some common threads that I think we should adopt in Malaysia, and we should think about very seriously. Something I've been talking about lately a lot is the idea of talent. So, I always ask, like, how many people do we have who can code and develop? Because we're talking develop startups, right? Build and write code. Because if you want to build technology ventures, people have to be able to create technology. But every single startup I meet from Malaysia, a lot of them say, oh, we're outsourcing our development to another country. Oh, my developers are in Indonesia, my developers are in Vietnam, or they're in India, or they're in some other nation out of the region. And to me, this is a problem, because if we don't have the internal talent to develop software, we cannot build our own unicorns. It's not going to be possible, and we're going to lose out, because the best talent in the world are being paid in US dollars or in better rates from other startups who are better funded around the region. The second thing about talent also is, how many skilled professionals will leave their corporate job to join a startup, right? And right now, if our startups are not funded well, that's not really a job option for anybody who's a professional, which leads me to my next point. Another thing we need to look at is capital. We need to make sure that we fund our startups. We've got a mission to have 5,000 startups in Malaysia by 2025, according to my digital blueprint. But I don't see enough venture capital funding in the country to be able to build 5,000 startups. We'll probably have 5,000 guys who create a product, and in 2 years, they will not be here anymore. And that's a problem, because we aren't able to give them enough capital to grow. Yes. And just one last point, I think the other thing is about culture. And maybe we'll talk about it later in the interview, about how I believe that we need to kind of build a culture of resilience, of creativity, and also the idea that failure is not the end, failure is an opportunity to learn. I think it's something that we can build here.
Aaron, Haritz here. Throughout our live discussion here, people are keep on commenting and giving their feedback on Twitter. We also live in Twitter right now. And one of the question is about financing, because of, if I can quote here, some say that the middle stage financing is the crucial part that we have yet to master, and how can we focus on this stage? Maybe you have some thoughts on maybe GLICs can get involved in unicorns?
Yeah, so I think, thank you for that question. I think it's a really great way to start it, right? I see startups, and because we're Malaysian, we may understand this. It's like when you launch a startup, it's like a baby turtle, and you need to get them to the ocean, and they're moving as fast as they can, trying to get to the ocean, and you hope they don't die or get picked up by a bird on their way to the ocean, right? And part of that is making sure that the startup is well funded and well supported, right? I agree. I think the big issue in Malaysia is that we don't have capital in the in-between years, right? From the time they start, maybe they can get a grant, and the grant will last them only so far. But after that, they need enough capital so they can scale. And if you compare them to our regional competitors, a seed round in Singapore is probably 500,000 Sing dollars or US dollars compared to a 500,000 ringgit round in Malaysia. And so by virtue of amount of cash to burn, Malaysian startups are at a disadvantage there. And to your point, I think I'm really excited to see that last week, Shell announced an investment in a startup, and we're seeing there's another corporate as well who also invested in a startup as well. So last week alone, we've seen some corporates get involved in the startup space. And I think government corporations or startups could be the key to ensuring that we're able to grow and scale our companies regionally.
And of course, Aaron, we've seen recently one of our startup, Kaudim, has called it a day after 8 years due to the prolonged lockdowns brought upon by COVID-19 halted the home services industry. Of course, Kaudim was born in Malaysia and has expanded into Singapore and also the Philippines. Now, we are talking about not just producing more startups, but resilience as well. How do we build resilience in a very challenging market condition?
So, I mean, I think Kaudim is a really interesting example, right? They're a company that started 7 years ago, and they built a business in a market that's actually very, very difficult. It's a very competitive space in the services space, and lots of players around the region have had challenges growing these businesses. And I don't know if really it's a question of whether or not they were unable to be resilient enough. I think they lasted pretty long. But what I want to say is that I think running a startup or any business is a difficult endeavor. Anybody who puts themselves out there, puts themselves in the ring, as it were, to build a company, deserves credit in and of itself, because that takes courage and takes resilience to do by itself. I remember when I was running my startup, I had at least 1 or 2 near-death experiences where we almost ran out of cash. We had to I had to think about not laying off staff or maybe closing the company down. So this is kind of a normal part of being in a startup. But one thing we can do as Malaysians is ensure that we're able to back these companies. And so when a company like Kaudim has challenges, they need to have quick access to capital to let them sustain through difficult times. They need to have intervention from mentorship and leadership to support them. But I will also say, the guys at Kaudim are smart individuals, and I will say that if they were to do a new startup, I will write the first check, no problem, at ScaleUp Malaysia, because we'll back them 100%. So I think when things don't go right, you learn so much more, and these guys have a bright future ahead of them.